This is Isaac Morehouse. Welcome to the podcast where we discuss education, entrepreneurship, big ideas, how to put them into practice in the real world, and above all, how to live free. Steve Patterson hates fun. Steve, why do you hate fun so much?
I'm just a curmudgeon, Isaac.
So what I want to talk with Steve about today is welcome back to the show first. Thank you for joining me a second time.
Thanks for having me.
Steve has a couple different blog posts, excellent blog posts that have gotten a great deal of attention and traction. One on metaphysics and then two on paradoxes. So I want to kind of talk about both of these separately, but there's some connection, and get a feel for why Steve hates all the things that make life so fun and open-ended and full of possibilities. So let's start with metaphysics. You have this great lengthy post. I don't know, maybe it's sensational to call it a takedown of metaphysics, but certainly of a popularized version of it. And there's you added a note to clarify later on after some feedback on the piece. That you're specifically addressing movies like What the Bleep Do We Know? And I read that and I was so heartbroken, Steve, because when I watched that movie, it's probably been 10 years or more, if it's that old. I think it is. It was like one of these great experiences. A friend recommended me. It was like, oh, it's just everything is just mind blowing. It's full of possibility. It's wild. It's trippy. And it makes you feel like, to me, like the world is this malleable place. Who knows? There's so much unknown. There's so much out there. Why are you going to rain on my parade and call it a bunch of claptrap?
Well, so there's one thing that can be said about the universe containing mystery, which it does, and it's exciting and it's beautiful. But it's another thing to claim that the universe contains paradoxes. And that piece that I wrote is specifically geared towards people. Well, it's really two groups of people. It's one who think that quantum physics implies that the universe is just a great pile of contradictions, all kind of merged on top of one another. And then the other group of people it's directed at kind of the Deepak Chopras of the world, who claim that there's this mystical connection between your consciousness and the entire universe. They say things like, that all of reality is contained in your consciousness, and that you can will things into existence, and that there is no external reality and everything is mind dependent. And they're beautiful ideas, but I think they're grossly inaccurate. And as it relates to quantum physics, the title of the piece that I wrote is called Quantum Physics and the Abuse of Reason. And that's a bit sharp, but I think to draw the connection between like mysticism, conscious mysticism, and quantum physics is really nothing short of an abuse of reason. The connection just isn't there.
So almost, okay, so I'm thinking of a couple books that I have read. It's been several years now, but that I also really enjoyed, sort of a layman's guide to quantum physics. The Fabric of the Cosmos by Brian Greene, and then there's one called The Quantum Universe, and I can't remember the author of that one. And they got into the Quantum Universe, got into some mathematical stuff that was a little bit heady. But both of them, especially the latter, seem to have, and maybe this is a marketing thing, this idea that all possibilities are present at once, or at least like until an observer focuses their attention on something, it doesn't take any specific form. And so in order to, and from a theoretical standpoint, this theory was put forward to explain experiments that didn't seem to have other explanations. And if you give it this explanation that all these possibilities are sort of simultaneously occurring, now you've got a world where maybe there's like 9 or 11 dimensions to make this happen. And these are all theories. And I think for the best physicists, they're theories they employ specifically to try to prove false, to see what would happen if that were the case. But you're maybe not so much ripping on the use of wild and crazy theories as a way, as things to test out and see if they explain the experiments. You're more ripping on the move from, hey, look, here's some physicists put forth this theory that this experiment could be explained if there were 11 dimensions, to someone saying there are 11 dimensions and you can transcend this one and move between them, and giving you sort of life advice based on that? Is that where your real beef is?
So there's two beefs. One's a little bit more controversial than the other. The one beef, yes, that's what I would call as the Deepak Chopras of the world that think, yeah, so my criticism is not that there's 11 dimensions. There might be 11 dimensions, but the connection that they're trying to make is with a very difficult topic, quantum physics, and another very difficult topic in consciousness. And then they say, well, these two topics are very difficult to understand, therefore they're blended in some way. And so specifically, the whole group of quantum, they're called quantum mystics, or sometimes the topic is called quantum woo, or quantum flapdoodle, as it's sometimes lovingly called.
I like that one. I've never heard that.
It rests on this idea that observation is what determines reality. And physicists would agree that it's true, observation determines reality. However, the first embarrassing error is made, and it's quite apparent that observation doesn't mean what people think it means. To a physicist, observation means like physical interaction with an object, or physical measurement of that's my dog whining in the background.
I was like, oh, you have kids. Congratulations.
No. It's physically recorded measurement. Not in any way does observation refer to human awareness of something. So the quantum mystics have taken this term that we usually talk about, we observe something, implies that, we're just looking at it idly. But in reality, that's not at all what's going on. Observation has nothing to do with human awareness. And they take this mistake and they apply it to like these epic proportions where they say, oh, look, this is proof that consciousness is in the center of the universe, and like all is one and all is dependent on your mind. It's like, no, this is just based on a terminological error. And so that's one of the reasons I think it's kind of embarrassing that a lot of these woo-woo mystical arguments come down to a basic terminological error.
So I remember, I think this was in What the Bleep Do We Know, or something like that. There was some, I don't know, experiment or claim that it was like water molecules that were frozen, and those that had people, it was either saying positive words or thinking beautiful thoughts near them. Mm-hmm. They froze in a more beautiful pattern, and those that didn't had like a chaotic pattern. Is this all just hooey?
Yes. And so the experiment you were referencing, I think the guy's name is Dr. Emoto or something like that. And so you can just Google. He's essentially a fraud. And there's a guy named James Randi who's the head, or the former head of the like Skeptic Society, something like that. And he has this challenge. It's called like the $1 million James Randi challenge. He says if you can prove some kind of like paranormal possibilities, ESP, or in this particular case that I don't remember if the experiment is saying nice things to the water or like taping the word love on the container which contains the liquid versus the word,
it might be something like that, one of those.
He said, if that can happen under strict controlled environment, that would be a candidate for winning $1 million prize for proving this kind of mystical connection with the universe. But Dr. Emoto refuses to take him up on the challenge. The way he constructs it, and I don't know all the details, but the way he constructs it in a way where there's a bit of funny business going on, and he's not willing to put that particular experiment to James Randi's test.
So in our previous conversation, when we were on the show last time, we talked a bit about how you have an appreciation for taking theoretical ideas, taking kind of intellectual academic concepts, and applying them to everyday life, utilizing big ideas in whether it be self-improvement or ways to, be happier. You're not averse to that. You don't look down on that as some maybe academics or intellectuals do. But it does seem to be, at least in the case of the physical sciences, that there's a danger of being too quick to make those connections, to say because on the quantum level, because when we're observing these microscopic particles or whatever, there are things that we have a hard time explaining, and therefore we're coming up with some theories about multiple dimensions, parallel universes, whatever may be possible. Would you say there's a danger in trying to say, oh, cool, here's this new research, the world is full of mystery and possibility, this is one of them, let's immediately turn it into 10 lessons to make your life better? Do you think there's something dangerous about that in a way that there isn't in trying to apply, say, philosophy?
Absolutely. And I am totally open to the idea that the universe is a really weird place. I mean, in my own personal metaphysics, I'm a dualist, which I actually call myself a reluctant dualist because I wish I weren't. But I think that the evidence points towards there's some kind of fundamental distinction between mental stuff and physical stuff, which is very radical. But I've come to that conclusion not because it makes me feel good or
That's
not
interesting because that
because
once upon a time that I don't think would have been radical. It sort of goes
right.
through phases. Yeah.
That's right. And yeah, it actually right now I think it's starting to become more popular. There's a philosopher named David Chalmers who's made some really clever arguments that a lot of people are starting to evaluate as, hey, maybe there's something to dualism. But this is very different than saying, hey, here's some unique scientific things. Now I'm going to incorporate it into like a fun worldview where it's like, hey, we can't know anything about anything because things are contradictory and the world is just this great blurry paradox filled with nonsense. And so I can believe anything I want to believe and I can create my own reality. It's like, to me, there's a very big gap between those two things.
Well, so let me ask you a question about effectiveness. So, my good friend TK Coleman, who's been on the show before, he has this very, very interesting worldview, I guess, where he says, look, I'm far less interested, though he believes certain things are true and are false. He's far less interested in whether they're true or false and far more interested in whether they're useful to him. He sees
Mm-hmm.
all ideas and worldviews as sort of tools in a toolkit that you can sort of pick up and use when they help you achieve your end. So
Mm-hmm.
what would you say to the argument that, look, Steve, whether or not my thoughts about these water molecules make them form into beautiful patterns, um, whether or not it's my belief that makes sure all the oxygen molecules in this room don't, move over to one corner and make me suffocate and die. Seeing that as a possible way the world works has altered my outlook. I'm more optimistic. I'm happier. It's become, like there's a reason placebos work, because if you believe they work, they make you, like, value is subjective, right? So if believing all these things makes me more capable of going about life happily and in a way that's fulfilled, is there a danger there? What's wrong with that?
So I would like to say that, it's great to be pragmatic and, ultimately we evaluate beliefs based on, their usefulness and whatnot. But to be quite honest, I think the exact opposite is true. That what we should be concerned with essentially is the accuracy of our worldviews, and then the practicality follows from that. So it might be the case that my value scale is based on my philosophic understanding of metaphysics, and if that strict cerebral philosophy is inaccurate, then my value scales are essentially going to be based on sand. It might be the case that there is a value system which you can have that's based on an accurate worldview. And if that's the case, I would say, without exception, reality is preferable to illusion. If it's the case that, nihilism is true and ultimately there's no meaning to anything and we're just kind of floating on this rock in outer space that's gonna get hit by an asteroid and we're all toast. If that's true, I think we should know about it, and I think we should act in accordance with that truth because it's true. And
So go
yeah,
ahead, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and if nihilism is true, I don't find it compelling that, oh, these illusory beliefs and these essentially lies, I'm tricking myself, makes me feel better, so I'm going to believe them. I'm not sympathetic to that at all.
Um, Maybe that's just because you place a higher subjective preference on truth than other people do.
Well,
We can come. Well, go ahead. Go ahead. You're going to say
I
something.
was just going to say that is true. It's true from a psychological perspective, and what I would say is in my own life. So in my upbringing, I was raised in a very like right-wing fundamentalist Christian household, and I tried to have the appropriate worldview in response to that. And so my value scale was kind of artificial based on those convenient beliefs that I held. And when I discovered that some of those ideas were inaccurate, it was devastating. It was absolutely devastating. And so I guess I've learned from experience that even if the truth is painful, good gosh, give it to me, give the truth to me rather than some, comfortable lie.
Would you consider yourself a skeptic, to use that label?
So I actually wrote a piece a while ago about that term. I would still consider myself a skeptic, but I think that term has been grossly abused because what's skepticism in my mind, what skepticism is kind of a default perspective of I'm not sure and I don't trust you. And I'm going to evaluate each proposition on its own merit. Period, without exception. It doesn't matter who the speaker of a proposition is. My default is going to be I don't know. And in that worldview, I absolutely consider myself part of that. However, what skepticism like means in pop culture is this kind of, oh, I'm an atheist materialist and I'm going to make fun of people who have these silly beliefs. And it's already a predetermined worldview, and I'm not in that group of skeptics. I mean, I'm a dualist, right? So I can't be part of that group.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that skepticism, just the word, the concept to me is like a very high, lofty, like beautiful ideal to question everything and demand, consistently that you get satisfactory answers. But as kind of a social movement, if you will, or a label, it is a little unbecoming these days when I see it almost has devolved to a kind of scientism, like hiding behind the word science. Like, oh, well, I don't believe in dumb things. I believe in science. And you're like, well, what the hell does that even mean? What is science? Like, can you define it for, oh, somebody did an experiment somewhere, therefore I believe that, not your silly foo-foo. And it's like,
that's exactly what it's turned into. And the terms like peer review get dropped all the time. Well, of course, the scientist and the peer review and the experiment and the data, those are all the key words that will alert you to somebody that has this kind of crude, very crude scientist worldview.
Yeah, it's I always feel like, just look, there's no such thing as science. Science is a process involving a lot of individuals who face different incentives, who have information. Sometimes they don't have information. You can't just say, well, I believe what science tells me. Well, science is not like a person that has a unified. So something you said about your upbringing and how it was very devastating for you to realize, and there was costs involved, right? Social costs, changing beliefs, where you grow up in a certain belief system that everyone holds, and if you come to realize those are no longer, you come to realize those are not true, it's very difficult to change beliefs just for your own sort of psychology. It's hard to deal with, but there's social cost involved. And you said because of that, you are wary of getting too attached to sort of a movement of beliefs or a set of ideas that have a high cost of changing your mind again. Do you think there's a danger there? Because I've seen this a lot. This is kind of the classic thing you see with like many atheists, for example. You get the feeling that they become only critics as a defense mechanism. All they do is criticize everyone else's ideas. They never want to be too cool for school. They never want to believe anything is true because the fear of being hoodwinked is the driving force in their life. The fear of being hoodwinked is actually greater than the thirst for truth. Do you ever fear that because of your experience of having a painful kind of shift in beliefs that you're erring too far in that direction, that you're just a little bit too skittish about getting hoodwinked? You don't want to get your heart broken again?
So that's an excellent question, and I'd say kind of. So in my mind, the way that my methodology works, for what it's worth, is I am like the slowest thinking snail in terms of being ready to accept a belief is true. I have a very limited worldview in a number of areas just because I really don't want to believe something that's inaccurate. And what I found is there's a few exceptions to this. For example,
well, let me ask you this as a default. When that is the case, when there's a whole lot of areas that you don't know a lot about and you don't want to form an opinion on, there's kind of two default approaches. One is to say, I'm going to assume everything said about this topic, because I don't have a lot of knowledge, is equally likely to be true, and maybe I'm just going to sort of assume the best and say, yeah, that could be true. That could also be true. Or I'm going to assume it's all equally likely to be false, and I'm just going to sort of assume it's all false until, false until proven true or true until proven false. Do you have a default one of those sets of assumptions?
Yes, it would be the latter.
Okay.
And so that's the reason for that is manyfold. So I want to say two things. One, first of all, the areas in which this isn't the case, where I'm not just confident in belief, I think I have knowledge, is in the areas of epistemology. So specifically in regards to like logically necessary propositions, things which can be grounded in logical proof, I have positive beliefs in. And I'm very confident and certain that worldviews that are based on logical reasoning are are accurate at their very bottom. I believe very strong. Well, I would say I have knowledge that at the very bottom of every single worldview, whether people realize it or not, there is logic and there is logical necessity. In regards to whether the default is, hey, this could be true, or and I'm just going to entertain it, or I'm assuming this is false until otherwise proven. The reason that I assume that things are false is maybe there's a bit of a curmudgeon in me, is because the areas in which I've studied, the professional opinion on any given topic is ridiculously inaccurate. So when you take the mainstream consensus views on economics, and they're horrendously wrong. I would say that if you take your average PhD, I say this in all sincerity, I don't think they understand clearly the basis of economics, which is economic growth comes from savings, not from consumption. I think there's a fundamental error that people don't understand. In philosophy, people don't. The mainstream expert opinion is not based in logic. It's based in empirics. It's based in scientism, and I think this is also a grave error. So I'm a martial artist. In areas of martial arts, with some exceptions, tons of the vast majority of martial arts disciplines are based in illusion. They're based in the ideas of for example, in hard styles of karate. Well, it's one punch to a kill rather than ground fighting and whatnot. They have these theories based on these horribly inaccurate beliefs, and then when two styles fight one another, you see which theory is more accurate. So the reason that I kind of assume I assume theories are wrong is because I assume people are inaccurate all the time.
Are you just unhappy all the time, Steve?
No, it's very happy. It's very liberating because I found I guess the exciting part to that is I've also found that in field after field after field, there's a common thread of sensibility through all of them. So there is a common thread in philosophy of people who ground their ideas in logic. There's a common thread of people in the martial arts who ground their ideas in ground fighting and sensibility, and in economics who understand the basis of economics. And it also, and coming back, because I say kind of everything comes back to philosophy. What I think the common thread is something like rationalism. There's something like the careful, very, 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 very careful construction of theories that one deduced from the next, all the way going back to like a self-evident proposition. That's the way of going about critical thinking. And it just so happens that most people don't believe that, and so I think most people's ideas are wrong.
What's really interesting about that is it's not that hard. Take a specialist in a certain area, take an economist. It's not very hard if you have a discussion with someone devoid of any other context and say, for example, do you think that economic value is subjective? Yes. Do you think that people, when they make a choice, when they take an action, they are choosing to do the thing that in their own subjective valuation is the most valuable to them at the moment? Maybe it changes later. And we'll say, yes, that's essentially a tautologist, right? And they'll say something like, yes, of course. And it really adds nothing to our understanding. Then they'll turn around and write a paper about a welfare economics explanation for why putting a price ceiling on will increase social utility, something that completely defies the very notions that they just agreed to, and they almost fail to see that contradiction.
Right.
Do you think that part of the reason that kind of basic logical test is missing from so many of these disciplines is because of specialization? You almost no one sort of has time to go learn basic logic and break things down to propositions, if X is true, Y must follow, et cetera. And they're spending too much time specializing? Or do you think it's just an innate human desire to escape from truth? I mean, which would seem very odd because truth is the most useful thing for us achieving our ends. Maybe, I don't know. What do you think is the reason that people like to move away from, you know, logical rigor?
Isaac, I don't know. That's a very difficult question. I can only speculate. Just pure speculation based on the interactions that I've had with a lot of people. I think that there is more weight that people give to um, pragmatism than accuracy of their beliefs. So, and this is true in academia, that people like, for example, there was one economics professor at Alfred University, where I got my undergrad degree. There was one economics professor, and he was on my little board thing when I was doing an honors thesis. He was on my board because it was about economics. And I went to his office, and I said, my paper was on the Austrian versus Keynesian perspective of the 2008 financial collapse. And he said, "Oh, Austrian economics." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, I wouldn't have a job if I were an Austrian economist." And I thought that was a very little interesting tidbit into like, look, I'll be the economist who runs the regression theorems, and I'll teach the students, and I'll write the papers, I'll get published, and it ultimately doesn't really matter if my ideas are a little bit inaccurate. And I think that happens all over the place. I think people just honestly don't care as much about the accuracy of their ideas as they do like the effectiveness of appearing smart or something like that. That's my best guess.
So I want to come back to something that you mentioned before about perception versus reality, and then maybe we'll move on to some of these other paradoxes that you've written about. You said something to the effect of, "I believe in every instance, knowing the truth is preferable to believing something that is untrue," or something akin to that. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah.
Okay. What would you say to if I said, "Look, I'm in a concentration camp somewhere. I'm getting tortured every day, and the reality of the situation is I'm not going to make it out. I'll be here for another month or two until I die, and it's terrible." If I indulge in a belief that is, if I decide to, adopt some sort of fantastical belief as a, I don't know, kind of escapism, engage in fantasizing, imagining that I'm somewhere else, taking my mind kind of out of the situation, and even fully believing in, something that turns out is not true. And if I did more research, I could find out was not true, that let's say I'm going to be rescued tomorrow. If that in that moment makes my life that much better and able to handle the difficulties and rigors, would you say even there that it would have been better if I knew the truth than if I believed something that was false but that made me happy?
Yes. There's a difference between
That's a very powerful claim.
Well, it is, and it's not very popular. And what I would say is this: that the instinctive response to say yes, of course, if it makes you feel better in that circumstance, believe it, is based on the idea, the philosophic idea that feeling good matters, and that human life and the pleasurability of human life matters, which is a debatable proposition. So if it's the case that things don't actually matter, then if you're in very difficult circumstances, and if you have a positive belief and you can see that, look, I am an ant, and ultimately it doesn't really matter if the ant gets its legs pulled off, then that's going to affect your perception of the situation. I'm not saying that you're an ant, and I'm not saying that things are meaningless, but it's all based on your deeper philosophic ideas. And what I would say, it would be a tragedy in my mind. And this seems backwards, I'm sure. It would be a tragedy in my mind if somebody willingly believed something that deep down they thought was probably false just because it made them feel good. I think it's far, 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 far. It's categorically more important to be concerned with accuracy than it is with pleasant feelings.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take. I mean, there's several things in there that I guess you you could never win an argument with someone who says, no, it just makes me feel so like I have no worries. It causes me no trouble that I believe things that are false or I don't examine them, whatever. I guess you could never necessarily convince them otherwise.
Right. Literally.
But I think there's something in that. It's too easy to see this discussion and say, okay, so a guy like Steve must find no value in, fantasy or science fiction or sort of, literature that has an escapist feel that is just, it's otherworldly. It's, watching The Matrix or whatever, so things that, superheroes, people doing things that we don't see, miraculous myths and tales that excite people. But I actually think that would be incorrect to say that. And maybe for aesthetic reasons you do or don't like those things, but I don't think your belief about wanting the truth and not wanting to believe things that are untrue affects our appreciation of those at all. Because I think if we really appreciate true myth and great storytelling, what we appreciate are not the parts that are factually untrue. We appreciate the truth in it, the broader truth. The reason that it inspires us is, because there's a truth in it that is displayed through a parable, through something fanciful. It's expressed in hyperbole, put in high relief to bring it out at us. Okay, the person can fly or whatever else, but the truths in that are really about forgiveness or overcoming great obstacles, having confidence in your abilities, finding whatever. There's always sort of these core truths within these fantasy and mythical representations. And I think that's what gives them their value. It's not the person who literally believes, the Lord of the Rings series actually happened in human history, at some prior age, is not getting more value out of them than the person who doesn't believe any of it's factually true, but is inspired by kind of the truth conveyed by the art. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, I completely agree with that. In fact, The Matrix is my favorite movie. I think it's brilliant.
I just watched it with my 10-year-old son. It was like a ritualistic experience. He is now a man.
It's funny. I think part of the reason that I got involved in the martial arts was because of that movie, because there's so many good fight scenes too. I agree with what you say, and I would take it many steps further. What I would say is fantasy clearly as fantasy gives you a deeper appreciation for reality. So when you have, for a great example of that, I wrote a long piece about this, which I won't go into detail, but a great example of this is in art and music and whatnot. You could have, I appreciate the art which is absurd. I love absurdist art. I think it's hysterical. It gives me a huge amount of pleasure to look at. Because I realize very clearly that it's not an accurate representation of reality. Like when you read Alice in Wonderland, it's hysterical. It's fun. It's because it's absurd, because things don't work the way that they work in that fantasy land, which not only makes you enjoy the fantasy land more, because it's like, oh, how does this other thing work, and what is, people speak in this ridiculous language, and it's funny, and you want to know more about the fantasy land. But also, when you go back to the contrast of reality, you have an appreciation for the way things work in reality too. So I think clarity in all circumstances just enhances life that much more. And I will say, not to go too deep or too woo woo, but in this pursuit of it, just in my own life, pursuing accuracy always, I think I have discovered something really, really exciting, and that it's the case that life isn't meaningless, and there's something out there which is worth living for and worth dying for, and life revolves around it. I think I've actually discovered that, which is something that I'm going to be writing about. I think this Friday I'm going to give a little taste of that.
Ooh, very, very cool. We might have to have a conversation about the meaning of life next time. Well, I want to talk a little bit about. We've addressed them in the context of quantum physics, these apparent paradoxes, something, both existing and not existing simultaneously. I do like, by the way, in your article on quantum physics, pointing out that Schrodinger's cat, which is sort of bizarrely used as look, this thought experiment shows us that things both exist and don't exist, was, originally conceived as a way to show how absurd that right. viewpoint was. But so we've talked about paradoxes in that context, but in a more general sense, you've written twice now on common paradoxes, like philosophical paradoxes. The Buridan's ass is one, and the other one is I can't remember the name for it. Like, this sentence is false.
The liar's paradox.
The liar's paradox, right? Give us a quickly explain both of those paradoxes as they're commonly put forward, and then we can sort of talk about what's wrong with them and the dangers.
Okay, so Buridan's ass is one of the old paradoxes it's actually really old paradox, but it was popularized by a French philosopher named Jean Buridan. And I actually kind of cheat in that example because I don't resolve it in the way that most people resolve it. It posits this thought experiment. Imagine that there's a donkey that is perfectly in the middle of two identical stacks of hay on the left and on the right. And essentially says if in that circumstance the donkey would be unable to choose which bale of hay to eat from, and it would starve to death because it would be evaluated perfectly identically. And yeah, I can talk about that if you'd like. And then the liar's paradox is arguably the most famous paradox, and in my opinion, the most difficult paradox and tricky paradox to resolve. And it's what you said. It's this sentence is false. And there's a lot of ways to rephrase it, but that's probably the most popular one. And yeah, go ahead.
No, and you're in both of these cases, you're not only trying to take on these specific paradoxes and say, oh, there's a way to resolve this. Your claim is, look, paradoxes don't exist. It's stupid to pretend that they do. A and not A cannot both be true. That's just the way the universe works. Stop thinking. Whenever you think you found a paradox, you're just defining something wrong or you're missing something.
Yes.
Why do you think paradoxes have so much pull? And why are you so keen on destroying everyone's fun with paradoxes? I keep saying you're not fun. I know that's not true, but I have to characterize you that way.
Well, so I'll deal with this second question first. What I would say is, I think I said this before, but at the very bottom of everybody's worldview and of every sensible proposition is logic. Logical necessity, logical structure, and logical rules are inescapably at the bottom of every sensible proposition. And it is necessary in order for something to be sensible that it presupposes logic. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but that is something I know to be true. This is not even a hypothesis. I know that this is the case. So when people come up with different constructions of sentences to try to argue that that's not the case, it's fundamentally, like, not only is it nonsensical, but it cuts at the very core of critical reasoning. If you throw out logic, or if you doubt logic, you're intellectually paralyzed. Whether one realizes it or not, you can't make any steps anywhere without logic, without tiptoeing into insanity. Logic is the be-all, end-all of every proposition of every field always, and it always will be. So that's the reason why I take it so seriously. And it's because people think that, no, it's a hypothesis, that logic is binding, and there are some ways we can get outside of it. No, you can't. I know that this is the case. As to why it's compelling to people, again, I don't know the answer to that. What I would say is nonsensical propositions have some kind of weird mystique to them. So when somebody makes their elaborate theory about the cat is sitting on the chair and it's not sitting on the chair, people go, ooh, that must be deep. I don't understand it, but because I don't understand it, that person's really smart. That seems to be what's going on. That nonsense, if carefully articulated, if you're just obfuscatory enough, then people will start really taking you seriously. In fact, there's a quote by who was it? I think it was Michel Foucault, who said something on the lines of
I can't make heads or tails of most of Foucault.
Well, part of the reason for that is that he intentionally was vague. Intentionally, because he said you have to have it, I think it was at least 5% nonsense and incomprehensibility in order for people to take you seriously. And of course, Michel Foucault happens to be an extremely popular French philosopher. So there's a reason why people can't understand what he's saying, or some parts of Hegel, and there's a whole genre of philosophers that are intentionally nonsensical, and it should be no great surprise that we can't understand them.
Um, it's interesting. I always found that the use of symbolic logic is very, in its most basic form, is like the ultimate, weapon against seemingly paradoxical or really confusing arguments. Because you start to realize that the words have so many meaning, and there's so many definitional problems,
Yes.
and there's so much baggage associated with terminology. When you remove that and replace something like, X or Y for the various propositions made, things come into clarity so quickly. I recently saw one of these memes, like the Velociraptor or something that someone posted, and it said, if free markets are so great, why do corporations need subsidies? And I was trying, it's like this gotcha moment, and I was trying to think there's a million ways you could go about
Exactly.
responding to something like that. And I usually don't like to get into these comment thread discussions. Somebody posting that is probably not that interested in actually a discussion anyway. But I thought, okay, if I had to, what would be the quickest, simplest way to diffuse this? Because there's so many things wrong with it. And I often find that boiling it down to symbols really, really helps. So I just sort of thought in my mind, and maybe this isn't perfectly accurate for that argument, but if free markets work, why do corporations need subsidies? Well, corporations getting subsidies are not any part of what an actual free market is supposed to be. And so I thought the sentence is, if X works, why does not X exist? And when you think of it that way, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, right? Like if eating healthily makes you, thinner, why do people not eat healthily? Like why does junk food exist or something like it's just, there's no truth value in it at all, but it's so hard to see with language. So, I don't know. I found that to be really interesting. And I think it's kind of sad that, it's such a turnoff. I don't know why that is. Even when I've done that in discussions, like, okay, let's boil this down. You're basically saying if Y, then Z, blah, blah, blah. And people immediately like start calling you names and be like, well, let's not get all technical here, Mr. Heady intellectual. Like as soon as you start using symbols instead of words, which can be much more clarifying, you kind of lose people. And I don't know, that's always been a pain point for me.
Yes. And I think language is naturally very ambiguous. And so what people do is they take ambiguous language and they think it's reflective of an ambiguous reality. And what they don't realize is that, yeah, you can create all kinds of funky sentences, be true and not true at the same time. But when you think about them and you try to clarify, okay, what are you actually saying as carefully as you can, there's no paradox there. I could say, for example, one of the sentences I like to use is, I am tall. Well, yes, that's true. I am tall. I'm 6'4". I'm tall. But on a basketball court, professional basketball court, I am not tall is also true. So therefore, I am tall and I am not tall at the same time. Like, paradoxes exist, and now we build a worldview based on paradoxes exist.
In order to explain it, we need to create new dimensions where you exist as tall in one and not tall in the other.
Exactly. And then, yes, that's exactly the way that I view the way people abuse language in this way. When really, when you think about it, it's just a vague proposition. The clear proposition is, in some circumstances, I am tall. And then if we were to try to construct a contradiction, it would be, in some circumstances I am tall, and it is not the case in some circumstances I am tall, which is obviously false, because if the former is true, then the latter is false, and it's clear as day.
Do you have any, for people who say, hey, I like what I'm hearing, I really want to become a clearer, more logical thinker, are there books, articles, thinkers, techniques, practices that you would recommend?
Well, there's a site called steve-patterson.com, and there's an author there that kind of takes this perspective.
He has some good stuff.
To be honest, no, I don't. I can. What I actually think, this sounds kind of contradictory to what I've been saying, but I think introductory logic courses, like undergraduate introductory logic courses that I've seen on YouTube and I experienced one in my undergrad education, I think they're actually pretty good. I think they have basic assumptions about symbolic logic, about dealing with P and not P, and P or Q and all this
or
stuff.
Even just learning the most common logical fallacies. I mean, whether or not you know the formal names given to them.
Right.
It's like once you have that, it's this fun game. Every time you turn on the TV or something,
Yes.
It's like, oh, I can point that one out. There's a ad hominem, there's a red herring.
Yeah, and you see it. Yeah, exactly. You see it all the time. I mean, gosh, if you're on Facebook at all, you see it all the time. People make strict logical errors nonstop. What one of the problems is, uh, so much of clear reasoning I'm discovering has to do with a clear metaphysical understanding about reality. That if you're using imprecise terms and the boundaries which you create in the world are imprecise, then you're going to get really fuzzy thinking, and it's not so easy to come up with a clear metaphysics. I don't think there's any really simple answer here for how to really ground yourself in as clear a worldview as you possibly can. It's a work in progress.
Hmm. So last time we chatted just a little bit at the end about your personal like writing habits and productivity, how you go about getting yourself to produce things. Um, I want to ask you a couple questions related to that. One, are you working on any more full length books? Do you plan to do more books?
I do definitely plan to do more books. This second, I'm not. I'm kind of. I have a number of ideas that I'm throwing around in my head, but I think in the short term, I'm just going to try to be more consistent with the blog work. One of the ideas I have is going to be a collection of essays about resolving paradoxes. It's going to be
Mm.
called Paradox Resolved, and it's going to be just a collection of the most popular paradoxes that are out there and their simplest resolutions. Right now, yeah, I only have like two or three. I think I have another website that I worked on a while ago that I dealt with some paradoxes. So that's probably going to be in the works, but
Okay,
uh,
so
yeah.
well, so when you wrote the book, what's the big deal about Bitcoin? Did you approach writing that book in a different way than you approach writing individual blog posts? Is there different things that you do, or is it essentially just the same?
Well, that was something that I would have gotten wrong before I started writing the book. I would have thought that you approach it very differently, and I don't know if this is just because of the nature of that particular book that it turned out this way, but I essentially I had a long list of topics that I wanted to cover. It was just that, I want to cover decentralization and the mining and all the different conceptual things that need to be covered. And then I just wrote a bunch of articles essentially, and then I put them together and conceptually linked them and made some segues, and it was pretty much no different than had I written each one of those chapters for an organization, which I was not expecting going into it.
Hmm. I noticed that you are on your website. You have something that you're a part of, Patreon.
Patreon, yeah.
Patreon. Tell me a little bit about that.
So there's a company out there that's called Patreon, and it was started by some musicians who saw an opportunity to help out content creators. Because right now there's not a great way to patronize people that are creating creative work. Um, so what Patreon is you can donate either based you find your artist or your philosopher or whoever it is whoever's producing work that you like, and you can become a patron of them. And what that means is either monthly, you give them a small monthly amount, $5, $10, whatever, or you can pledge per article that they write or per music video that they publish or per web comic. You throw them a couple of bucks, and it's like crowdsourcing, patronizing of the arts. And so
That is a really interesting concept to take this very, very old, and there's debates among, I think clear thinking people in the artistic community or people who have studied literature and the arts about the pros and cons of the patronage system
Mhm.
of old, where you've got some king or something who pays you to compose music. Um, whether that's more or less constraining to the artist than, let's say, being trying to sell your stuff in a market or to a publishing company. But it's a very old idea that
Mhm.
hasn't really been in use as much today. But combined with crowdfunding, it's like a combination of patronage with this broad market process. It's like paying someone to do it because you trust that what they're going to produce will bring you value before they actually produce it. It's a very,
Right.
very interesting concept.
Yeah, and it's all no obligation. So at any time, if you don't like the work that somebody's producing, you just cancel, and you're not charged anything. And it's an experiment. For me, I know a lot of people have had success with it. I know the genres are like, music producers and web comics for some reason have
Hmm.
become real popular there. And the title of my work is it's something like Steve Patterson is creating philosophy that doesn't suck. That's the niche that I'm trying to fill. And right now, I think I've got something like $19 a month. So but I just started, and I have a lot more content that I'm going to create, and we'll see. I have really no idea whether or not it's going to work out or not.
Yeah. So I have to ask you. I mean, that's a weird. We're entering this new world where all this sort of crowdfunding stuff is possible. Did it feel a little bit weird or embarrassing to be like, hey, do you want to support me to do philosophy? I know, sort of an old school mentality. I can picture like a parent or something being like, what? You're trying to get people to just voluntarily give you money to think all day or whatever. Why don't you go work for a university? But was that a little bit vulnerable? I mean, like, what if you only ever get, $7 a month or nothing? Or what if you get a lot and then you feel like if somebody sees you out at a steak dinner, then like you feel guilty that they're supporting you? And you know what I mean? Was it weird for you to make that decision?
Absolutely. Without a doubt. And part of it too is I'm going about this outside of the academic system, which is kind of another layer of preposterousness. That I'm saying I'm trying to create very, very high level philosophy in a very clear way that's accessible to people, and I'm doing it, writing on my laptop, and I'm not in school. So there's a lot of layers of presumption, and I don't know if I'd say it's embarrassing right now. I think right now it's kind of exciting because the book has been pretty well received, and I've got a lot of people have donated some Bitcoin I just released an audiobook for free on YouTube. And so far I've had good success, and so this seems like a natural progression. But yeah, I mean, if I'm going to be making $20 a month through the site, yeah, I would say there's probably a measure of embarrassment, because it would be reflective of like, hey, bud, you think too highly of yourself. People aren't willing to pay this, $3 a month, even for the work that you're doing. So, I don't know if I'll make a lot. I don't think I'm going to be making a lot of money through it, but if I do, I don't think I'll feel too scared about, taking people's money and using it to buy good food or anything. Because, and maybe this is again is my own my self delusion, but I think the quality of what I'm producing, if people take the time to read it and don't care about my credentialing, I think it's very high.
Yeah.
So I'm okay with saying that, and put me to the test. People check out the site and see if you think I'm just deluded. But I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I think it takes a lot of humility to do that. There's often a popular conception of arrogance and humility that I think is almost backwards. That, oh, if you go out there and put your stuff out there for the world to see, and even have the audacity to say, support me financially for this,
right,
that's some kind of arrogance. But if you've ever tried to do something like that, it takes more humility than probably anything else. I mean, to be willing to put yourself out there and to say, hey, evaluate my work on its merit. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't. Just be that open about things. So I think it's very, very cool. So like I like to do, I found a way we're going to tie all that we talked about together with a whole bunch of alliterative. We got popular physics, paradoxes, productivity, and patronage. What do you think?
Okay. I think it's brilliant.
Oh man, Steve, this has been great. I encourage listeners, you can go to steve-patterson.com, check out Steve's stuff, and we hope to be talking to you again.
Thanks, Isaac.